there would be all these interrelations and so on, but they would be peaceful interrelations. Because the kinds of reasons we would have for, conquering other territories and so on wouldn't be there anymore. I mean, one of the reasons why you want to go out and conquer somebody is to seize their capital, as it were, right? Primitive.
Right. Yeah. And you wouldn't need to do that because you would be in cooperative production with everyone around the world.
Right.
Right.
That would be the ideal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That would be communism.
That would be international communism. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, let me ask you one more question on this. And then I want to ask you about Zizek if you have a few more minutes.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Okay.
So Terry Pinkard is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He is the author of Hegel, a biography, Hegel's Phenomenology, the Sociality of Reason, and Hegel's Dialectic, the Explanation of Possibility, along with other books. You've also written extensively on Sartre. Is that right? Professor Pinkard, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast, and thank you for having me. Time. Yeah. I wanted to start just by asking you a kind of a really basic question about yourself, which is, how did you come to be interested in Hegel? Why Hegel for you?
Well, with many people, I kind of backed into Hegel. That is, as a student, of course, I was in the 60s, right? The early to mid 60s, I was very interested in Marx. Mm-hmm. I also became very interested, in just philosophy in general and social theory in general and Kant. So if you start with Kant and you have Marx, you start wondering, then as you read more and more about both these people, you keep running across Hegel. So you figure eventually you've got to get around to that. Mm-hmm. And of course, like many people, I was also interested in Sartre, and Sartre's, moved to a kind of Hegelian Marxism later on in his life and so on. Mm-hmm. So that's more or less it. It was a matter of political commitment, intellectual curiosity, and I backed in. Like I said, I backed into Hegel, going forward from Kant and backward from Marx and backward from Sartre and Heidegger and so on.
Were you a part of the student protest movement at that time? Were you?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah,
engaged in protesting the war in Vietnam and the civil rights protesting, or with the civil rights movement and all of that.
Oh yeah. I mean, those were the issues of the day, and that's what we were carrying on about at the time.
Okay. Were you a member of SDS or anything?
Yes, I was a member of SDS. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I want to start out, as we talk about Hegel, asking you, kind of telling you a story about my own experience not studying Hegel. I majored in philosophy as an undergraduate at Portland State University in the 90s, and I was not made to read Hegel. I recall a course. Yeah, I had a course that traced a philosophical inquiry that I really recall having an influence on me, and we started with Locke, and then went to Berkeley, and then Hume, or Berkeley, and Hume, and then to Kant. Uh-huh. And then after that, we were done, and I took a course on Wittgenstein. So at the time, I was frustrated. Like, I felt like I hadn't gotten anywhere, and it seemed like I was like learning philosophical arguments only to throw them aside, to dismiss them, and I felt like it was sort of a dead end. Like I could play this game of philosophy, but it didn't connect to my life. And I was political, but it was the 90s, so my politics were about reading Anarchy magazine and going to see Noam Chomsky and and that kind of thing.
You could have done worse.
Yeah. So, but So why am I right in thinking that Hegel was sort of dropped from the American university curriculum?
Oh, yeah, it's a long and complicated story, but Hegel was dropped for a variety of reasons. I mean, first, let's put it like this. In the First World War, there was a tremendous anti-German feeling in the United States, such that even John Dewey got into the act of, condemning everything German philosophy and so on. And after the Second World War, Karl Popper wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, right, where he accused Hegel in many ways of being the author of kind of totalitarianism and fascism and so on. This is the same time in the post-war period when all the anti-totalitarian stuff was coming to the fore. So Hegel was blamed for, you might say, German militarism in World War I, Nazism in World War II, and for being just a complete and total obscurantist, right? So this also came back to, Russell and Moore at the very beginning of the 20th century were breaking with their Hegelian teachers and so on, the older guard there at Cambridge and Oxford. And so Hegel was regarded as an obscurantist who didn't understand modern science or logic. He was then blamed, at least in the American scene, for World War I and World War II. Right? Then he was blamed for being the author of totalitarianism. So he was in pretty bad standing, you might say. So we wanted to understand why Hegel dropped out. The other thing, of course, about this is that there's, getting rid of Hegel as part of the great creation myth of analytical philosophy. That is, analytical philosophy was born specifically by people like Russell rebelling against Hegelianism. So they weren't rebelling against Spinoza and they weren't rebelling against this or that. They were rebelling against Hegel. He was so it's only by killing Hegel did analytical philosophy arise. And thus you got this kind of view that, still is prevalent among a lot of philosophers that, that you don't need to read Hegel. It's kind of, I don't read Hegel and I'm proud of never having read Hegel. So that's part of the background of all that. Of course, one of the things that happened was that, and one has to remember that in 1959, when Peter Strawson published Individuals, an essay in descriptive metaphysics, that doesn't sound like much, but in those days, having the word metaphysics in the title of a book by an Oxford philosopher was considered really incendiary. Then also, Strawson's identification with Kant in all this was also incendiary. So Kant made it back onto the scene. And then with Rawls, Kant made it big time onto the scene. So, and it's only, you can only go down the Kantian road just a little while before you start looking to see what's coming next. And the next thing you know, Hegel was back on the agenda again. But
well,
really,
that's what I felt like. I think I didn't know it, but I felt like I was missing something. Like after Kant, it's like, like, wait a minute, this didn't resolve anything. What we need something else.
Yeah.
So you started studying Hegel in this context where he was no longer part of the university. How did you study him in university? Despite that, did you find a school that would teach that? Were you an autodidact? How did you actually?
Well, I was quite lucky in the time that at the University of Texas, where I was a period when both John Finley and Klaus Hartmann were visiting professors there. And they, Finley had written a book called Hegel, a Reinterpretation in 1958 or so. That was the first of the wave of the new wave of Hegelianism and so on, though it really didn't have that much of an impact on things. But at least Hegel was there among people in the philosophy faculty who were talking about Hegel, right, in a positive way here. So in that respect, it's just, kind of rank contingency. Otherwise, I would have been an autodidact. Wouldn't have been anywhere to study Hegel, and I would have just had to do it all on my own.
Okay, so you got lucky there. So let's talk about Hegel himself and how somebody who's like coming to him without a lot of philosophy background, or maybe not having any understanding of the Marxist tradition, might think of him. Like I'm putting myself back in my undergraduate day. It's like when I was an undergraduate, I bought a book called The Worldly Philosophers. This wasn't taught either, and it begins with a chapter on Adam Smith. Yeah, and I'm wondering, should we put Hegel into a book like that on the Worldly Philosophers? How does he fit within the context of the bourgeois revolution that book was sort of about? In fact, it describes the bourgeois revolution at the start, saying, mankind had gotten along in the comfortable rut of tradition and command for centuries, and to abandon this security for the dubious and perplexing security of the market system, nothing short of a revolution was required. So should we think of Hegel as a revolutionary like Adam Smith?
Well, look, this is a kind of loaded question. I mean, as if everything Hegelian, right? The answer is yes and no.
Right. Okay.
Now, remember, Hegel was born in 1770. That meant that when 1789, he was 19 years old. Here, right? So he and his two roommates, right, Friedrich Hölderlin and Friedrich Schelling, here, were both, all three of them were caught up in the French Revolution. Right, this is the excitement of it all. They were in Tübingen, which had links to all these places in France because the Duke of Württemberg also owned all this property, feudal property in France and so on. So, for example, one of their good friends, a guy named Wetzel, was forever running away and joining the French Revolutionary Forces, and then coming back just in time to take his exams, passing them, then running back to join the Revolutionary Forces. So, first of all, he's very taken up with the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. He maintained his interest in the French Revolution, his support for it, his entire life. Every July 14th, he celebrated the French Revolution with a glass of champagne. Right. Mm-hmm. It's a very nice little story about this. This is in 1820. Edward Gans tells the story of going with Hegel and some other students to Dresden to look at artworks. And when they go out to dinner later, and Hegel dismisses the kind of local wine, the local Meissen wine and so on that they have, and orders instead the most expensive champagne in Europe, Champagne Sillery, for his students. And of course, the students were all kind of astonished, why the old guy was doing this, right? And he poured, a glass of champagne for everybody, and raised his glass and said, "Gentlemen, you know what today is?" And they all said, "No." He said, "It's July 14th, to the storming of the Bastille," as he raised his glass. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he kept the adherence to the revolution, right, for all his life. In some respects, he thought of it as a kind of bourgeois revolution, though not in the sense that Marx thought about it. He thought it was really a revolution of just complete overturning of the old order. And now we had finally the realization that he had been arguing about, that essentially the concept of freedom was to be extended to everybody. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel was very good at, and lectures on art and all this stuff, he was always very good at coming up with very nice little one sentence, kind of abbreviations, because, he knew that the students were often tuning out. And so you needed little headlines to keep them tuned in. Mm-hmm. And it was that history moves from one is free, a kind of emperor or chieftain, to some are free, a kind of a male aristocracy, to the idea that all are free. Mm-hmm. And that nobody by nature has the authority to rule anybody else. And the French Revolution was the achievement of that, he said. So he was very much, so his thought was very much tied into the revolution. Now, one of the ways to look at the later Hegel, back up in 1807, he published The Phenomenology of Spirit, which he said is really, he says in the preface, everyone around us can see that a new world is being born at this point here. Mm-hmm. By the time he finally got a job teaching as a professor of philosophy in 1818, that's 10 years later. In the meantime, he had been jobless, then he was editor of a newspaper, then he taught high school for a number of years and so on. Napoleon had come and gone, right? The Congress of Napoleon had been attacked. He lost the Battle of Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna set up to turn the clock completely backwards, right, to the days before the French Revolution. They were unable to do that for a variety of interesting, still disputed historical reasons. Mm-hmm. And so Hegel then was faced with the question of, what is our modern world going to look like now in this post-revolutionary order? Mm-hmm. And that's when he began to write his mature philosophy and his mature system and so on. But it was always still in the context of the revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the big Hegel book that I've actually read is The Phenomenology of Spirit and some of the Science and Logic. So I guess I've read the immature Hegel, and not your translation. I should read your translation, I think, right?
I think you should, yes. Everybody should read my translation. Yeah, no, I wouldn't call it an immature book. Hegel was 30 when he did it. That book is also astonishing. It's basically a first draft. That is, he wrote that from scratch, just created it in roughly 1806. Just sat down and got this idea and started going.
My question about whether or not he should be put in the worldly philosopher book is also about like how he conceived of what he was doing in terms of philosophy or politics, I think. I mean, should we read Hegel in the philosophy department? Is that where he belongs? Or should we be reading him in political science? Or, I mean, I guess maybe this whole notion of the worldly philosopher is sort of needing to be unpacked for me, even though I think I know it, I walk around, think I understand it, but like I get, like, for instance, was Hegel tackling trans-historical philosophical problems, or did he see himself as engaging with problems as they came up politically and historically?
Well, the answer is, once again, both. It is
right.
One of the striking things about Hegel is that he is this kind of grand systematic thinker. And so his first, the big book to start the system off is The Science of Logic, which is about as abstract and abstruse a work as you could get. And as he puts it, it's just pure thought thinking about itself. It's thinking. Yeah, he puts it in one place. But he also was a worldly philosopher. That is, he said in the preface to his 1820 Philosophy of Right that the purpose of philosophy is to grasp its own time and thoughts. Right? And what he meant by that, in fact, he called the book, he said it's the Grundlinien. It's the kind of baselines of the philosophy of right and law and morality. But it's just the baselines. So what you do when you're grasping your own time and thought, he says, is you're looking at your own time, trying to figure out what's essential to it, what's really going on, what's really at work, and what's only peripheral. And you want to know where you came from, right? Where you are, and what is on the agenda now, and what are the possible solutions that are out there. And so you're not just doing, say, a snapshot of your own period or anything like that. But you really are trying to figure out how you got where you are, how you got here, and where you are going and should be going. And so he always understood that there are lots of different alternatives that are going to be coming up here. And part of his philosophy was to try and outline now some way in which we could respond to the new market society, for example, that was now taking over. This new emphasis on human rights, right? The new emphasis on a certain type of international order, and so on and so on. And also, along the way, questions about, so what role is art going to play in all this? Is this going to change the role of art in society? Right? What would a modern religion look like? A modern kind of up-to-date version of, say, Christianity look like? And also, what would be a modern philosophy in a modern university setting? We also forget that Hegel's one of the people who designed the university that all of us went to. I mean, the Berlin university system that was established in 1809, right, after the almost collapse of Prussia in 1806 in the Napoleonic Wars, was that it was to be what, as it was done at the time by Wilhelm von Humboldt, who gave the sketch for it, is to be a research teaching university, Lehre und Forschung, where instead of the old model of the university as teaching orthodoxy, right, where the professors just professed the orthodoxy, whether they believed it or not, that's what they professed. This was to be the place where kind of the creative minds were to meet, young people kind of on their own turf and take things forward in a progressive fashion. The central faculty was called philosophy. By the time that model got transferred to the United States, it came to be called the College of Arts and Sciences, but it was philosophy at the time. It included all what we would think of as the natural sciences and so on, too. And Hegel was not the author of that, but he was one of the architects of the original Berlin University that kind of put it into the shape that it was, made it so famous, and made it then more or less the model of universities around the world to do teaching and research, to keep the ball moving. So Hegel's philosophy is systematic, right? It's both very abstruse. It's about metaphysics and logic. It's also about its own time grasping thoughts. It's about politics. It's about art. It's about religion. Fundamentally, Hegel oriented this all around one central question, which was, he said, it's essential to Geist as this kind of I translate Geist instead of mind or spirit. I don't translate, but I think you should interpret it as equivalent to self-conscious life. Human life is self-conscious life. And the fundamental feature of self-conscious life as Hegel had it, was to try and understand what it was to be a self-conscious life, what it meant to be a self-conscious life. And you can now read the history of the world as various attempts, politically, aesthetically, religiously, and so on, to come to terms with that. And one of the features of our modern attempt is that we think that we got to be making progress, and we also think that everybody's free. Everybody's entitled to the right to freedom and so on. But this is all held together by this question of what does it mean to be a self-conscious life, and how do we get an interpretive grasp on that? Since every time we give an interpretation of ourselves, we make ourselves into a moving target that just keeps now. As soon as we've got it, now we've changed.
When you say that, I think to contemporary ears that maybe there might be a chance for a misunderstanding, because when you're talking about a self-conscious life, you're not talking about just like advice for individuals. Like, you're not saying, how do we help ourselves to know ourselves? You know, it's more as a social question for the whole of society.
Right. Well, this is a very good question. Here's the short Hegelian answer. The short Hegelian answer is a large part of the modern world has tried to understand this is only an individual problem. But in fact, we are individuals only as part of a larger social network. We are inherently social. Our capacities for rationality and self-understanding are social capacities. We have to understand that. We have to have a place for the individual and a place for the sociality and so on. And of course, it is one of the pathologies of modern society that, you know, we tend to think of this as purely an individual question, as if I somehow have all the resources I need on my own to answer that without having to rely on anybody else. And that is an illusion.
Right. But it's not that we shouldn't seek as individuals to have a self-conscious life and be free as individuals. It's just that for individuals to be free, Hegel would say that the entirety of society would have to be free as well.
Once again, you know, you can be free only if others are free, right? The Greek solution was, of course, the opposite. It was that, right, some, the males of the Athenian polis, could be free only if other people were not free, only if women and slaves were not free, because you could only be free if you could participate in all these discussions. So the dirty work had to be handled by other people. The modern principle is we can be free only if all are free. Here.
Right.
That's a very different kind of view there.
And how does that, because when I was back to my undergraduate days, when I was taking these classes as a philosophy student, the big question that I thought we were tackling was how do we know things?
Yeah.
Like, what is reason? It was always this epistemological approach to reading Locke and reading Hume, and so on. And so by the time we got to Kant, it was still about, you know, how do we know the world? How do we claim to have a reason that can justify our own activity? So how does Hegel combine the need for freedom, this idea that, like, I guess the creation of civil society creates a world of freedom, a social totality of freedom, and the epistemological question of, like, how we know things, or what is reason in that world?
All these are great questions. They're all the things that, you know, bothered Hegel. So Hegel begins the 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit by saying the question is one of how do we know things? And then he introduces immediately the sense of vertigo, right? That whatever kind of principle you bring up, right, is itself now open to question. So it looks as if it's just all, you know, all open to question. You can have a lot of different kinds of views and so on. So as he puts it, it's right. Puts us on a path that looks like it's just a path of despair here, right? It looks like we're just gonna have to give up on never claiming we know anything. But in fact, he says, let's start out with something that looks like it's absolutely certain here. And that's just the idea that whatever else, I'm aware that of things right here, right now. I may be wrong about which things are here right now, but I'm aware of things right here. I'm aware of something at least.
Is that similar to what Descartes came up with? Is I think, therefore I am?
It's similar. It's similar, but again, you know, interestingly different, because it's not a I think, therefore I am. It's just I know that there's something here.
Right.
Right. He called it this here now. This here right now. Now, one of the things he tries to do is to try and show that if you try and take that out, once you start thinking about that, that breaks down as a unified account. It ends up being a kind of contradictory account. And to make that work, you've got to realize that you were never really just saying this here now. You were also talking about things with general properties. And then that looks like it's enough. And then it turns out actually, to talk about things with general properties, you have to talk about them as in a background and their relation to other kinds of things, as expressing certain types of regularities and laws and so on. And so yet again, it's broken down and now requires something further. And when you look at that kind of thing, then you understand that really there's a kind of self-consciousness going on there.
Right. That's where we get to maybe that, I think.
And then all of a sudden it turns out that self-consciousness is not itself just automatically going to solve all the problems, because there are the differences that self-conscious agents have about now what counts as a reason. Who speaks with the authority of reason itself? And that gets you into a competitive struggle, right, about who speaks with the authority of the whole, of the totality. And that resolves itself in mastery and servitude, which itself then falls apart. The master demands recognition from the slave, but the master at the same time claims the slave doesn't have the authority to give the recognition. Right? So you're forever, as if saying, Doug, recognize me. You say, okay, I will. So well, it doesn't count, though, because you're not the kind of person who can give me the recognition I need.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to go, this is familiar territory.
Part of you might say part of Hegel's dialectic,
Right. I just want to go back to so you begin with sense certainty, and by beginning, you're presuming that there's an attempt to understand. There's something that you want to know. Maybe you don't even know that there's a you who wants to know, but there's a questing after knowledge there to interact with the world. So it's dialectical kind of from the start, right? It's not just a being, it's not just existence, but there's a relationship, there's a seeking after.
I'd say what happens is you start out relatively certain about something, then you find that you're contradicting yourself. So you find you're just babbling.
Yeah. Okay.
So you say, back up. Let me think. Okay, here's what I really meant. I really meant this. But then you start contradicting yourself again. You find you're just babbling.
Right.
It's that finding yourself babbling, right? Not making any sense. That is what is driving on that part of the dialectic, at least in the phenomenology.
Okay. So
let me give you an analogy. And he starts
give me an analogy. Yeah.
The science of logic, right? He starts out in the same way. He says, what is the most general concept we could have? And it's the concept of just being, to be, isness, you might say. Good. Okay, what does it mean to be? Well, it means not to be nothing. What does it mean to be nothing? Well, it means you're not being. So being and nothing just mean not each other. Okay, now, what's the difference between them? You can't state the difference. Now you find yourself babbling.
Right, because once you try to state a difference between being and nothing, for instance, I would say, if it exists, if it's a being, then it would have extension.
That's going down the road now. Here, I was already you're already far down the road from this.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But to say that, it's you would then ask extension in what, right? And then I would say, well, let's say it's in nothing. Then does nothing have an extension?
So you get this idea of negation just built in to the system of thought, and it's. What I think is driving everything, and once again, what's driving all this is the attempt to make sense. The Oxford philosopher A.W. Morris talked about in relation, say, to Wittgenstein. There's making sense of things, and there's making sense of making sense. Right. And
right.
Philosophy, in many ways, is about making sense of making sense. What are the parameters under which we can make sense?
Right.
That's why Hegel calls his first book Logic. We're looking at the parameters of sense making. But it's also metaphysics. It's also about things.
So let me ask you about the self-consciousness, why you replaced spirit with self-consciousness. Because I'm trying to figure out how Hegel is historical, like how this is different than maybe the way Plato would have approached the similar kinds of questions. And so the need to make sense, or to, would that be also similar to like the need to justify your opinion? Yeah,
related to it, yes.
Mm-hmm. So this need to make sense, it seems like it arises when you find yourself babbling. Is that right?
No, that's kind of the way the dialectic works. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
We find that. I mean, it's probably because the need for it arises when we find that we're not making sense.
Like, put it to it this way: in that book on the world philosophers, they said, well, they had spent centuries in a rut of traditional society command,
Yeah.
And I kind of imagine that if you lived in that rut, the need to make sense might not be so readily apparent, even if you were getting reasons put to you. Or the difference between like a university system where you just recite doxa rather than try to create a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The need to actually make sense might not be as evident.
Right.
It'd be more like rote memorization in that system.
Heilbronner's book on the worldly philosophers
Mm-hmm.
states a kind of thesis about modernity.
Oh, you knew which book? Did I mention his name? You knew which book it was.
I read that book a long time ago.
yeah. 1953. Yeah.
Yes, it states a thesis about modernity.
Mm-hmm.
That modernity is this break with the past, and that the reason we broke with the past was we were in a rut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then now we figured the way out of the rut. In this case, it's not a dialectical book. It's really a book that we, at some point, you can argue about which century, 15th, 14th, 16th, 17th, whatever, right? 18th. We threw over tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we quit relying on sacred books or the voice of nature or, our holy ancestors and so on, right? We just started inventing all this stuff, right, with reason alone. And now look what we've done. I mean, we've got, all this great market economy and everything's just hunky-dorky and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's a certain type of story that modernity has told of itself. It's certainly a story that is still alive and kicking, although it's breaking down in all kinds of different ways now. And one of the things that Hegel wants to do is historicize that story of modernity, to understand why it was that modernity took that kind of form of understanding itself as breaking entirely with the past and thinking now it's thrown out all. There's no continuity. It's just throwing out all this stuff and so on, and that we've also replaced it with a whole bunch of other better ideas and so on, etc.
Right.
So, I mean, Hegel very much historicizes all this. He wants to say that modernity is a particular kind of story that Europeans started telling themselves at a certain point in time for a certain type of reason having to do with the kinds of difficulties they were finding themselves in and so on.
Mm-hmm. So, but that means that reason then, in the abstract isn't historical exactly, right? I mean, what you're saying is, it's not as though the modern person just invented reason and for the first time we had to try to make sense of the world and, no, that there were attempts to make sense in Plato's day. Obviously, Socrates was attempting to make sense of things like what is justice.
Yeah.
But would the difference between the kind of modern reason and the reason of in the time of Socrates be this self-consciousness
Hegel wants to say, yes, it was about a certain type of self-consciousness. It was a certain type of way of understanding what it was to be a self-conscious being, what spirit meant to itself at that time. What it was to be geistig, right? The Greeks had a particular kind of conception of that. Hegel thought it also involved a kind of deep contradiction in itself, because it was a view that held that there was a certain kind of and for example, with Socrates, there was a certain type of universalistic morality that was possible. Right? Hegel says in his lectures on the philosophy of history, he says, people often talk of Socrates as the discoverer of morality. Actually, he's the inventor of morality. Right? Is rather than there being rather than our say our obligations and so on, our commitments being bound to a certain type of social and cultural, sphere. Rather, what this type of reason was taking us was to morality, which is a universalistic sphere, binding all humanity here.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, right, the Greeks didn't have a conception of how you could possibly have, say, an individual, right, with full individuality in this kind of polis. And the kind of strains that this put on the polis were just too much to take, right? So what began to happen was, Hegel thought, is that as the Greeks lived out this kind of thing and this kind of life, and this philosophical questioning with Socrates and then Plato and then Aristotle so on entered, that the kind of Greek life that they had began to look like it made less and less sense. As if life, completely were to be exhausted in being a member of the polis, and that required slavery, and that there was, no other way to run an economy other than a slave economy, right? Other historians have since made this kind of point, right? That by and large, right, for the ancient world, slavery was just the way things were done. Maybe considered to be unfortunate, to be very bad business, and so on. But on the whole, nobody questioned the institution itself. Mm-hmm. And that put too much of a strain. Eventually, in their tragedies, particularly in something like Antigone, right, the Greeks began to put on stage now not a philosophical, but a kind of aesthetic, artistic representation of what they were about, and it didn't make sense.
Right.
Right. And that began, so it's when they stop making sense. Suddenly at this point, right, philosophy arises. Philosophy comes on the scene as this form of life is on the way out, basically.
Right. Well, I'm going to make a kind of a lateral move here. I'm not sure if it makes sense, right? But, when I think about this moment when things stop making sense in philosophical terms, I think of it as like maybe a limit to reason. It points to a contradiction in our own thinking, and that it shows where we have to stop, because at this point when we hit this contradiction in our thinking, we can't go any further. And Kant writes about this, these contradictions that arise, and he posits that the world that really makes sense, the world as it actually is, the truth about the world is really outside of our domain. We're not going to ever get to it, but what we can understand is only how we attempt to make sense. The different categories that are in our sense-making apparatus, like extension or time or things like that. And Hegel was not content with that limit, right? Did Hegel think that we had access to a way of making sense that would be, the way we were going to make sense forever? We could not end up babbling again.
This is the great question about how historical Hegel is and so on. Look, let me make a distinction. It's a Hegelian distinction, right?
Okay.
Distinction between a Grenze and a Schranke. Yeah, right. Between a limit and a boundary.
Okay.
If you have a boundary, it's the kind of thing that you run up against a boundary. Maybe you can't get over the boundary, but you can see that there's something on the other side.
Right.
I mean, you can come up to a locked door to a room, right? There's another room there, but you have no idea what's in the room. That's kind of, in some ways, that's Kant's idea of things in themselves here, right? That there's something on the other side of the boundary. We know it's there. We can't see over the wall, but we know there's something beyond the wall there. The limit, on the other hand, is where you reach simply the very limit of what is making sense, such that trying to go further is just when you start babbling. Right? So a limit, there's no other side of the limit in that case, if we're making this kind of limit boundary distinction. Boundaries have other sides to them. You can always imagine jumping across to the other side and seeing What's in that locked room here? With
Okay.
limits, there's nothing on the other side. You just reach the limit of thought. This you gave Hegel the idea, right? What we really have to do then is test the limits of thought, right, to the utmost degree. That's what I was saying. So we start out with the kind of ground zero concept, just is, being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then we find that, right, we're pushed further now by just trying to even state that.
Mm-hmm.
As you're trying to even talk about what it is we're talking about, we find ourselves babbling all of a sudden. And therefore, as it were, you kind of correcting ourselves, saying, okay, no, what I really meant was this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, okay, now what I really meant was this, though.
Right. Okay. So, did Hegel believe that there were these limits then?
Yeah.
And Kant thought the same way, that there were these limits that.
Well, Kant thought there were limits to what made sense to us, but these limits were boundaries.
He did.
Yeah.
So he thought we could see what's on the other side.
There are
numinal realm.
Yeah, well, there are things in themselves. We know that. I mean, you might put it like this. This is not quite right, but right, close enough, right? We know there are things in themselves independent of us. We have no idea what they are. In principle, no idea. We don't know whether it's one big substance like Spinoza thought, or it's a bunch of different forms like Plato thought, right? Or monads as Leibniz thought, right? We have no idea. No idea, and we'll never know because it goes beyond the bounds of the kinds of things we can make sense of. Kant thought. So that's just a boundary on our thought. Hegel thought, in principle, there is no boundary. Now, you can put it like this, right?
But there might be a limit, though.
There might be a limit, yes. Now, one of Hegel's contentions that he had with the Romantics of his own day was the Romantics wanted to say something like, well, there are limits to reason, but these limits are just kind of boundaries. There's something out there that we can get at in a non-rational way. Maybe through the emotions, or maybe through a kind of special type of intuition or something like that.
The third eye, we could, like
so,
Doctor Strange or something like that. Yeah.
So the Romantics thought something like that. And this goes down to our day, right? There are people who say, look, reason runs out, but there's not to worry. There's a way to get at these things that don't require reason.
Right.
Now, Hegel is, as it were, the rationalist, saying, no, in principle, reason is going to be supreme. He also thinks this is the principle of modernity. That, as it were, right? We used to think there was a kind of divine boundary to our thought. There were a few things we just had to accept on faith. Modernity, in its full flowering, says reason is what counts.
And yet, so how does Hegel handle these contradictions that arise as boundaries or as limits?
When they first arrived, they seemed to be limits. It turns out that there were only boundaries. Right?
Okay.
We seem not to be making any sense, and then we change the framework so that we now can understand why we had been in the situation we were in when we were not making sense to ourselves anymore. And now we are in a position where we can see that more clearly.
Okay, now I'm gonna jump again, and I don't know if I'm not sure if I'll be making sense, but I want to go to Marx.
Okay.
And ask is the difference between Hegel and Marx, the difference between is what happened with Hegelianism is that it stopped making sense, and then Marx came along and said, we need a new framework to understand this so it can continue to make sense. The Hegelian approach is limited to the realm of philosophy, to the realm of thought, maybe even to the realm of social relations in the abstract. But what's missing is material production, material creation, the way we organize ourselves to put food on the table and to build, the houses that we live in and so forth. Was that the reframing of Hegel that Marx contributed, do you think?
Well, that's certainly the way Marx talks a lot of the time, right? That Hegel was a kind of idealist, and he found Hegel standing on his head, and so he put him back on his feet. But, you put an idealist back on his feet, they're still an idealist.
Right.
So, this is one of the most kind of up for grabs still controversial aspects about what the relation of Hegel to Marx is. It's pretty clear that what Marx said about Hegel's philosophy of right early on in Marx's career in 1843 is that Hegel has gotten it wrong about what the state is. Hegel more or less got it right about civil society being this kind of competitive or heavily marketized arena, and that he thought that there was an institution called the state. It's a fairly new institution in European life called the state that could speak for the authority of all of society and balance out these kinds of conflicts. Marx thought that was just a mistake about what the state was. And it was because Hegel wasn't really paying attention close enough to what the productive relations were that he was unable to see this. So
to the market, to what's going on in the market.
Yeah, well, just productive forces in general, right? Hegel's talking too much about making sense of things. What he really should be looking at is how are things produced in the first place.
Okay.
Right? And so as I see it, what Marx thought, right, was that Hegel had taken things only up to their kind of penultimate stage, right? And you could already see, Marx thought by the 1840s, how the Hegelian synthesis that seemed to fit the 1820s now was coming apart. Industrialization was setting in. The rise of a widespread European proletariat was beginning to take shape and so on in ways that it simply hadn't been, right, in Hegel's time. Right? The Industrial Revolution was really just getting underway when Hegel is still alive. So at this point, it's clear that the Grundlinien, right, the baselines are now themselves shifting, and that what's on the agenda is also shifting. And therefore, we need to now really rethink this kind of thing here. And one of the features of Hegel's philosophy of history, I think Marx does take over a bit, is that the way Hegel looks at, say, political history particularly, he looks at it as not just political, but also political and cultural and philosophical and everything. And what happens is, right, these Gestalt des Lebens, a form of life, as Hegel calls it. These forms of life break down when they're no longer making sense to themselves. And the people now living in the rubble of that breakdown have to pick up the parts that are still working and throw away the other stuff that isn't working and build something new that looks like it's going to be stable until it starts breaking down. And what Marx is saying is Hegel's system as portrayed in the 1820s now is in fact breaking down. And we are, soon, right, we will be living in the rubble to try and pick it up. That will be the socialist revolution. Right. So the French Revolution, which we'll now call the bourgeois revolution, is not the last one in this case.
Right. But of course, that revolution didn't really even end until into the 20th century, right? I mean,
we're still, you could say anyways, look, we're still fighting it out. The French Revolution proclaimed, liberty, equality, and fraternity.
On that basis, yeah. But I'm just thinking, like, you've gotten rid of most of the aristocracy, and you don't have czars. You have, right, some sort of formal democracies dominating the globe. That's, takes until after World War II for that to really be the case. It seems to me.
Also true. Yeah. And it's also, I think, true. One of the ways you can look at it slightly more abstractly, you can say, look, one of the things that happened in the French Revolution is that people like Marx thought, Marxists for a long time said, this was a bourgeois revolution. Then there were all these, historians who stepped in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on and said, actually, if you start looking at, who benefited from the revolution, start actually looking at the facts on the ground here, a lot of aristocrats benefited from this. This new market society that got opened up and, the new relations of property. And they made a killing in real estate. They made a killing by investing in the railroads. They did all this stuff here. So, there was a bourgeoisie that, benefited. There was a bourgeoisie that also lost a lot. There was aristocracy. What really happened was the political role of the aristocracy vanished. They no longer automatically had this kind of rulingship. But still now this overall group of people, I say the group of people who are still giving the orders are the people who control the wealth and finance and things like that.
Right.
And that group of people has never gone away.
Right.
The great democratic movements of the late 19th and also during the 20th century have been movements to try and actualize the potentiality of the French Revolution, to claim that we really do want liberty and equality.
Right.
And what we've had instead is a group of, the ruling class holding on to this. Now, individual members of the ruling class come and go, but a ruling class that controls the means of production and finance and so on is still with us.
Right. Right. And so, but did Hegel believe that you pretty much had to have that ruling class? Is that what the philosophy of right was about?
He doesn't think that there has to be a ruling. He thinks there can't be a ruling class. Right. He thought, first of all, the state is supposed to be an institution that works for the interests of all, mediates and so on for the interests of all. And there is something that's called the universal class, which is the technicians, bureaucrats, experts, and so on who run the government and kind of keep everything in order here.
Right.
But no, there's a very interesting little piece in the Brockhaus Encyclopedia of 1824. There's an entry on Hegel. And it's written by a guy named Wendt, Professor Wendt of Leipzig, who was also an acquaintance of Hegel and knew Hegel well. And the particular entry on Hegel also has some biographical details that people wouldn't have known about unless Hegel told them. Right? So Hegel almost certainly saw this entry. And Wendt says in this entry, I'm getting to the real point, he says, some people have accused Hegel, right, of basically, acting really in the interests only of a kind of ruling elite in society. But his philosophy has never meant, right, provide any, basis, right, for the ruling class, the herrschende Klasse. He uses the term Klasse there, of the ruling class. Instead, it's about, reason and this and that and so on. And that seems to be one of the ways in which Hegel was at least trying to signal now, not by any writing on his own, but by having a friend do this for him. Right? He is not, right? He has in no way provided support for the ruling class.
Right. And that would have meant the aristocracy at that time.
Well,
right?
It would have been mostly the aristocracy, at that time.
So I recently watched an interview you did with a bunch of people from the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I'm friends with some of them, like Clint, for instance. And you got to a point where you claimed, and I don't remember the full context of this, and I wish I did because I could ground it better, the question, but you claimed that Marx thought that Hegel had made a mistake, and not just a trivial mistake or a political mistake, but a philosophical mistake. And that's where you stopped, and then you didn't explain more, and the next question didn't pick that up. So I want to pick that up. What do you remember this part of that conversation, or what philosophical mistake did Marx think that Hegel had made?
Marx thought the philosophical mistake Hegel made was that he thought that it was possible for there to be a particular group in a class-driven society, right, that could speak with the voice of the whole, speak with authority, and speak for everyone. That was a mistake, and that was not, I'd say, a contingent mistake, as if Hegel had picked the wrong people to do this. So Marx thought that this would only be, what Hegel wanted to accomplish would only be possible in a classless society. Right. And that I think is what Marx took to be the philosophical mistake in Hegel's view. So what's Marx's alternative? Well, I mean, you look at, the one place where he talks about what communism is going to look like is in the Civil War in France, where he says the Paris Commune. He says, gentlemen, this is communism. Here, this is basically, so Marx's view is basically that communism is going to be the Greek polis without slaves and the oppression of women.
Okay.
It won't be a state. It'll be a relatively small community now working in tandem and peacefully with other communities and so on and so on. Marx may have been naive about that, but nonetheless, that's more or less his view.
What about something like the general intellect as a part of Marx's view? Like we don't want little small local communities, but we want to bring the mass of humanity together
Oh yeah, yeah.
To produce the world. So it'd be like the Greek polis, but on a global scale.
No, the Greek polis more or less on a global scale. Yeah, there would be all these interrelations and so on, but they would be peaceful interrelations, because the kinds of reasons we would have for conquering other territories and so on wouldn't be there anymore. I mean, one of the reasons why you want to go out and conquer somebody is to seize their capital, as it were, right? Primitive,
right? Yeah, and you wouldn't need to do that because you would be in cooperative production with everyone around the world.
Right.
Right.
That would be the ideal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That would be communism.
That would be international communism. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, let me ask you one more question on this, and then I want to ask you about Zizek if you have a few more minutes. So my last question along this, do you consider yourself to be more of a Hegelian or more of a Marxist?
Yeah, I regard myself more or less as a Hegelian. I put all the proper, I say, provisos, and I don't buy this, I don't buy that, but yeah, I call myself a Hegelian.
As opposed to like a Marxist. Do you think that's a distinction worth making?
Well, now, I would say I'm a Hegelian very influenced by Marx, as opposed to a Marxist very influenced by Hegel.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. This is an argument that I have with colleagues in China, right? I say, you guys are all Marxists who are influenced by Hegel. Right? I am, on the other hand, a Hegelian influenced by Marx. I'm also Hegelian influenced very much by a certain type of liberal tradition and so on. Right?
Yeah. I worry that I'm a Hegelian influenced by 80s sitcoms.